In this podcast, I will analyze a group of films made possible by the main film discussed in the previous episode. Illogical and fantastical as zombie flesh eaters may be, our understanding is generally that the events depicted are actually happening. But the three films to be analysed in this episode, which have become known as the Gates of Hell Trilogy, are not generally bereft of narrative logic, but the legitimacy of the events within is always questionable. To put it simply, it is not uncommon in these films to be unsure whether a given event is real, an imagination, or a nightmare. This is perhaps the most infamous section of Lucio Fulci's career, set in motion by zombie flesh eaters, but made a pattern in the Gates of Hell trilogy. I am the Italian Horror Guy, and this is the Italian Horror Guy podcast. The first film in this trilogy, City of the Living Dead, Fulci, 1980, contains the premise that the gates of hell have been opened, which seems to give the narrative creative license to do as it pleases. The next film, The Beyond, 1981, is almost entirely lacking in narrative cohesion, and anything seems possible. For example, at one point a man is thrown from a ladder in a library, seemingly by sudden thunder outside, landing on the floor before being eaten by a number of tarantulas. The scene, whilst visually striking, as one might imagine, contains no relationship with the rest of the film whatsoever. In fact, there are no other mentions of spiders before or after this scene. All linked together by a gothic feel and Lovecraftian monsters and blatant Lovecraft references, the trilogy culminates with The House by the Cemetery, also 1981. Borrowing elements from both the previous films, Cemetery is actually told from the perspective of a child. The Gothic. Fulci's Gates of Hell trilogy is neither entirely Gothic nor entirely Lovecraftian, but it contains elements of both. Both Gothic texts and Lovecraftian texts share stylistic similarities, and significantly, they both fall well within the horror genre. Both contain a vast fear of the unknown, a paranoid fear that something lurks in the shadows, and generally, something is lurking in the shadows. Lovecraft's work, like the Gothic, is paranoid and uncertain, nightmarish even, like the horror film. In his essay, Nightmare and the Horror Film, The Symbolic Biology of Fantastic Beings, which considers the manner in which the imagery of the horror science fiction film is constructed in ways that correspond to the construction of nightmare imagery, Noel Carroll defines many elements of the horror. Significantly, this was published in 1981 in the midst of the production of the Gates of Hell trilogy, and therefore the film examples the uses can quite readily be related to Fulci's work, arguing that horror has been tied to nightmare and dream since the inception of modern tradition. In many moments of his Gates of Hell trilogy, it appears that Fulci's films are deliberately evoking Gothic tradition, and thus even the most generic tropes and expectations of the genre can be found. Nonetheless, more intricate definitions of the genre are just as important. Gothic has been defined accordingly to its emphasis on the returning past, its dual interest in transgression and decay, its commitment to exploring the aesthetics of fear, and its cross-contamination of reality and fantasy. That's according to Spooner and McAvoy. The Gothic is rife with the blending of binary concepts such as old and new, reality and fantasy, and human and monster. The Gothic of the Beyond. Gothic literature has historically been analysed as being a product of the national context of where it was written, Smith uses the example of Shirley Jackson's 1959 novel, The Haunting of Hill House, saying that, like many other American Gothic novels, it examines the experiences of many white middle class American women in the 1950s who felt trapped within domestic spaces and felt unable to develop a model of identity that was independent of family life. Fulci evokes an almost identical scenario in The House by the Cemetery. An example that truly emphasizes this is the way the film's mother figure is unable to escape domesticity. This is in spite of her being played by the same actress, Catriona MacColl, as had appeared in the previous two Gates of Hell films in leading roles, no less. MacColl's character is of far less significance to the plot of this film, that it in fact is told from her young son Bob's perspective. In fact, her entire role in the film revolves around protecting Bob, which she is ultimately unable to do. Ironically, the ending of the film strongly evokes the terror of being trapped within domestic life, seemingly ending with the idea that Bob can never escape the house by the cemetery, as will be further explored. Robert McGill's essay about American Gothic literature focuses principally on London and New Orleans as the quintessential Gothic cities, respectively, the birth and current resting place of urban Gothic representation. New Orleans is the haunted house of un American activities, an outpost of the old world even up until relatively recently, McGill says. New Orleans allegiances make it a temporal and cultural anomaly, a breach in the fabric of time and space. Ghosts and other world and other old world demons naturally slip through, finding it a conducive port for entering the new world, he continues. Miguel links the significance of New Orleans, which he argues differs from the London Gothic model of being found in isolated vestiges nestling cheek by jowl within the modern fabric of the city. The Beyond is set in New Orleans, and the hotel is quite representative of the idea that this city stands against modernity. Indeed, the premise of the entire film revolves around the hotel, which represents the binaries of the old and the new, and the dead and the living. The opening scene of the film provides a sense of history by being shot in sepia tone and providing a subtitle explaining that the setting is Louisiana and the year is 1927. It is a flashback from 1981 where the main body of the film is set. The opening sequence reveals that surrounding the hotel are trees on one side and a river on the other. A man inside, a soon to be accused warlock named Schweik, paints a rather foreboding looking painting of a destitute and desert land and what appear to be dead bodies scattered around. A number of angry people arrive at the hotel, some quietly by boat and some by car. This creates a dichotomy in the film between the ancient and the modern that is a constant element throughout the film. Highlighting the terror of this dichotomy is the fact that the unwanted guests murder Schweik in a particularly gruesome way by pouring quicklime on him. Indeed, the film evokes a sense of the ancient about the hotel, which is initially purchased by in the modern day body body of the narrative by a female New Yorker, Liza, who intends on renovating it and opening it for business. However, the rundown state of the hotel, it has many dilapidated rooms and a vibe it has been abandoned for a very long time, is a picture of the ancient and the fearful, the Gothic. Given the monstrous nature of Fulci's Gates of Hell trilogy and the nature of monsters in these films, understanding Gothic sensibility and monsters is crucial. Patricia McCormack in Baroque Intensity, Lovecraft, Le Fanu, and The Fold explains the haunted nature of Gothic stories. Gothic sensibility is a haunted one. Protagonists are haunted by memories, by ghosts and supernatural beings, but the uncanniness of the familiar made familiar and the familiar made unfamiliar, and by their own selves, which are often alienated, not known to themselves, impressionable and frequently ill. Dr. Freudstein of Cemetery can be considered in this context. He is linked both to Frankenstein and Freud by name. Both are poignant references given the nature of Frankenstein's monster and Freud's notoriety for child psychology. Indeed, childhood is of regular significance within the genre. Sue Walsh argues that childhood has a particular and complex relationship to the Gothic. Perhaps both City and the Beyond are reflective of this ambivalence, but Cemetery is much more explicit in the depiction of the child. Church outlines the fact that Cemetery contains poetically Gothic scenes involving children. When Bob's babysitter finds herself locked in the basement, she screams out to him. Bob is playing with his toy monkey when he hears her. He picks up a toy gun and carries it to the basement with him. The scene cuts between images of the babysitter having her throat cut and Bob walking towards the basement with a toy gun in one hand and a toy monkey in the other. Here, childhood itself is entwined with the Gothic. It is not just the child and his apparent belief that he is playing a game as he has been with his toys, but the fact that he fails to comprehend the danger. The very fact that Bob is the only character to this point in the film that truly comprehends the danger of the house, it is quite disconcerting that he considers this to be a game. Throughout the film, Bob seems to have an ambiguous relationship with the horrific, despite May, his little friend, representing the supernatural world that threatens and ultimately destroys his initial way of life. She is also his best, and indeed only, friend throughout the film. The uncanny transitional. Given all three Gates of Hell films are made by an Italian director set in America and contain Italian, British, and American actors, it is important to understand the transnational nature of the Gothic genre. We might argue that many different factors that influence these films help create the sense of the uncanny that is expected of the Gothic film. Consider the very fact that in Cemetery, the characters move from New York to New England, or even the fact that the film's exteriors were shot in America and the interiors in Italy. Similar arguments can be applied to the dubbing of Bob in Cemetery. Despite Bob being portrayed by Italian actor Giovanni Frezza, he is voiced, according to imdb.com, by Lyle Stetler, who, perhaps unsurprisingly, has no other credits to his name. Bob's voice is extremely high pitched throughout the course of the film and on many occasions seems disproportionately louder than the events going on around him. While watching the film, it is close to impossible to imagine the voice actually belonging to the actor, which of course it didn't, but this is made even more impossible as the dubbing is particularly shoddy throughout the film. Whether deliberate or not, this contributes to the sense of the uncanny in the film, as Kerr analyzes. The construction of an uncanny performance in the transnational, non-English speaking Gothic horror film emerges from a dynamic between the actor, the viewer, the sound, and the subtle but uneasily rests on the voice. Kerr does, however, make an observation that could well be challenged. He argued that while such vocal paradoxes are enlightening when considered alongside Gothic horror traditions, the voice on screen is still rendered somewhat familiar. I would like to contend that when the synchronization of the actor is so far out, especially when it is so hard to imagine that voice actually belongs to the actor, it is impossible to feel a strong sense of familiarity as a viewer. That is to say, when a loud and high-pitched voice can be heard as Bob's lips are barely moving, recognizing the language he is speaking is the only element of familiarity. Gates of Hell. Perspectives. Progression of childhood in Gates of Hell. We'll start with City of the Living Dead. City of the Living Dead provides a stepping stone towards the much more child oriented cemetery, helping to set the scene for where the trilogy culminates is the rather strange end to City. Among all the horror that unfolds in this film, it is a young child, John Robbins, who has the most traumatic experience. Entering the film initially as a peripheral character whose sister has recently died, he sees her appear at the window of his house as a zombie. The horrified child tries to explain his experience to his parents, but they mistake his explanation for something he has imagined. Slightly later in the film, John is shown in his house having just phoned some adults to inform them of something horrific that has occurred with wide eyes and he is covered in sweat. The camera zooms in on the kitchen table, which is covered with a clean white tablecloth, some plates with sliced bread on them, and two glasses of milk. But destroying this idealistic image of the family home, a few drops of blood fall into one of the glasses of milk, and it becomes apparent that John has just witnessed the murder of his parents. It is significant that a film with such excessive violence would not show this murder on screen, instead using the horrified face of a child to paint the picture. Throughout the film, the adult characters are generally killed quickly, and thus their trauma is short-lived. For John, who survives, trauma is implicitly ongoing and surrounds him. This character becomes somewhat perplexing in the last moments of the film. Mary, played by the soon-to-be familiar Catriona MacColl, emerges with a non-event character, Jerry, from a catacomb. John notices them and enthusiastically runs towards them. And Mary and Jerry's faces alter from happy to apprehensive as they notice him. The very last moment of the film is a still and close-up image of John, over which we hear audio of Mary yelling fearfully before John opens his mouth, and we hear the sound of Mary screaming, "No," repeatedly. This moment connects the horrors that the adults have truly comprehended with those that perhaps John has not to this point. Conflating the sounds of a terrified adult with the image of a running and excited child leads perfectly into the final image. His face had appeared quite happy initially, but as the image pauses, the final shot of John is of his open mouth, and we hear a very loud scream. It appears to be coming from the child's mouth. At this moment, despite all he has witnessed, the film suggests that John was still able to appear as a happy child, as if everything had simply been a bad dream. An animated shattering effect appears over his face and expands over the screen. The image has the quality that it appears drawn by a child, and it covers up his entire face. The screen becomes black, and the credits begin. Symbolically, this is the shattering of his childhood. It provides a basis for the next two films in the trilogy. In particular, The Beyond contains a character of an adult actress playing the role of a traumatized child, while The House by the Cemetery is a film which the story is actually told from the perspective of a child, as mentioned earlier. Unlike City, however, in these later films, the audience is not spared the horrific images the children see. Now we move on to The Beyond. These horrific childhood experiences are present throughout the Gates of Hell trilogy. In The Beyond, for example, a young girl is introduced by visiting a morgue with her mother to see her deceased father. In a horrifically violent and inexplicable scene, the mother has a large amount of acid poured on her face, in which her daughter is forced to watch. After the mother dies, her father returns as a zombie. Her character is largely unseen from this moment on until the latter stages of the film. After a long scene in which the male lead, John, struggles to dispatch a large number of zombies by not shooting them in the head, John and Liza suddenly notice the child has turned as well. John immediately shoots her in the head, which effectively explodes. In the house by the cemetery, all of this culminates, at least from the perspective of children in these films. It sets the scene perfectly, or the previous two films have set the scene perfectly. Because Cemetery is told largely from the perspective of the child, I think it is important to provide a plot synopsis to more thoroughly understand this perspective. So, a young boy, Bob, looks at a picture of a house on the wall from his home in New York. He asks his mother why the girl in the window is telling him not to move there, but his mother cannot see the girl, of course. The family moves to the house by the cemetery at the whim of the father. While Bob's parents talk to a real estate agent, Bob sits in their car and has a telekinetic conversation with the girl from the picture, May, who tells him he should not have come. As the family settles into the house, strange things begin to happen. An unfamiliar person appears, says she is the babysitter, and Norman, Bob's father, hears a strange, childish whimpering noise despite Bob being asleep. Norman conducts research at a library while Bob plays with May, and his mother, Lucy, hears strange noises in the house and has a panic attack. When no one is home, the real estate agent enters, but is brutally murdered. The next day, the babysitter mops up the blood, which Lucy notices but fails to acknowledge. Soon after, the babysitter is decapitated by a knife-wielding assailant in the house. Bob sees the babysitter's severed head in the basement, but Lucy does not believe it happened and puts him to bed. Bob wanders out of his bed into the basement, but the door is locked behind him. As Bob attempts to escape, the murderer pushes Bob's head into the door. Lucy is unable to pry the door open, and Norman returns, explaining the man in the house is Dr. Freudstein. Eventually, Norman and Lucy break into the basement as Freudstein, who, according to Norman, needs human victims to renew his cells, prepares to attack Bob. Freudstein rips Norman's throat out, killing him, and Lucy and Bob try to escape through a small gap at the top of a stairway. Freudstein captures Lucy, but Bob is pulled through the gap by May, and Freudstein is not seen again. May's grandmother, also a Freudstein, walks them both down the drive of the house by the cemetery, but a panning shot reveals lights are on inside. Throughout Cemetery, Bob lacks the ability to control his own destiny. In his very first scene, after he asks his mother why the girl in the picture warned him not to come to the house, she says, "Maybe she didn't want you to have to pack away your toys like you were supposed to." Bob giggles at this response, which upholds the cutesy facade, but still insists to his mother he was telling the truth. As the film progresses, the doll Bob receives from May becomes an even more significant representation of childhood culture. However, the very fact Bob's parents only see the doll rather than May represents their desire to retain his subordinate role in the family. While May represents fear and horror, she also represents freedom for Bob. That his parents can only see her as a doll can be read to indicate their desire to conserve a version of his childhood that suits them. Of course, Cemetery is told from Bob's perspective, which is no surprise. Fulci himself perceived children in an interesting way. Children believe in a universe of their own, which means that to us, they are different, monsters, aliens. We're always trying to insert them into our world. We show them its worst aspects, he stated in an interview. Bob cannot be inserted into the adult world, as the world in this film is not an adult world as his parents believe, but the world as only the child can understand it. Bob, as exemplified by his telepathic communication with May, has an understanding of the horrors of the world that his parents are ignorant to. The film can be read as the nightmare of a child, given it presents Bob's perspective and terrible things. But the film also implies that a child's imagination is monstrous in and of itself. Cemetery, therefore, might be considered more an imagination than reality. For example, when Bob first meets May, he sees her in the flesh and they communicate face to face. However, moments later, when his parents find him, May has been replaced by a doll which bears the same striking red hair of May. Later in the film, when Bob tells his parents about seeing May when out with his babysitter, the babysitter denies having seen her and assures the parents Bob was in her sight the whole time. Once again, Bob carries the doll. Given that no adult, except May's potentially imaginary grandmother, actually sees May for the entire film, it is possible she is simply a figment of Bob's imagination, an extension of his red-headed doll he so desperately desires but real in an otherwise lonely and adult-dominated world. Additionally, Bob is aware of a constant threat to his family's safety, which turns out to be a human-zombie hybrid, Dr. Freudstein. On various occasions throughout the film, Bob tries to make his mother aware of the threats of the house, only to see her dismiss them as childish fantasies. In the film's conclusion, however, his parents finally discover Bob's fears to have been legitimate, as his father reveals the truth of the monster's existence. A vindication of Bob's insistence is the fact that he is being attacked by the monster when his father makes the revelation. His parents' terror and desperation help free him from the monster, but they are both killed in the process. Ironically, the more believable but unproven existence of a little girl, May, saves Bob from the much less believable insect-like human zombie. The patriarchal father. In relation to the child, the patriarchal power is represented ultimately as a monstrous force in the house by the cemetery and something that can be escaped in the film's rather ambiguous ending. Having witnessed his parents being brutally murdered, Bob escapes what might be termed the real world and is rescued by May and her grandmother by entering the world Bob saw in the picture at the start of the film. In the real world, Bob's father, Norman, is patriarchal and controlling. He makes the decision the family will move away from New York despite the protestations of both his wife and his son. And when his wife begins to realize there is a monstrous force in the house, he simply ignores her. Rather insultingly, he even advises her to take some pills that he says were prescribed by a baker. Additionally, Norman's control is emphasized by the fact that he realizes there is something terrifying in the house and that he researches it and even returns briefly to their home in New York despite having disallowed his wife to go home to safety when she had suggested it. But the ultimate patriarch of the film is, of course, Dr. Freudstein, who literally consumes those who enter his house in order to replenish his cells and remain immortal. His patriarchal power over children is represented by the sound of weeping children that he emits. His monstrosity in his appearance, he is the size of a normal man, but his face is unfamiliar and terrifying. He has large eye sockets with seemingly no eyes, and a narrow nose outline that leads down to a mouth that appears as if it would open from the side and is a jumble of flesh and teeth. When combined with the strong wheezing sound he makes, one might describe this face as one that exudes putrescence, truly in the vein of Lovecraft. As Bob escapes the patriarchal Freudstein and moves into the other realm of the picture, ambiguity about his fate persists at the film's end. Although he has escaped certain death at the hands of Freudstein, the world as he knew it no longer exists, and presumably he remains trapped in this alternate reality beyond the bounds of the film. Yet, despite the sense of entrapment, in another way, the ending is somewhat of a haven for Bob. His patriarchal father had led him and his mother into the actively dangerous patriarchal Freudstein. However, the new realm in the company of a surrogate family initially seems to offer him some safety at very least. Despite all the patriarchal struggles, Freudstein is the ultimate evil of this film. In his study of the European horror film, Ian Olney analyzes the significance of the figure of Dr. Freudstein, saying he blurs boundaries of life and death, human and inhuman, animate and inanimate like other postmodern monsters, and that this breaks down our understanding of the natural order. Olney believes Freudstein is not pure evil, as the latter's intention is to preserve the traditional notion of family by eliminating all threats to the father mother son structure, and that Freudstein only kills Bob's parents in self defense. Olney continues Freudstein's murderous impulses are otherwise almost invariably directed at those whose desires run counter to the Oedipal norm represented by Norman and his family. As such, the new world at the end of Cemetery might in fact be just as terrifying as the one Bob has just escaped. The only two people in this world appear to be May and her grandmother, who is revealed to be Freudstein's wife. Upon Bob's arrival into this initially safe place, the grandmother declares to May, "Now that Bob is safe, you can surely act like a Freudstein." But Bob and May have escaped their oppressive patriarchal families and will presumably live eternally in the circular world of the picture. While this ending is as bleak as the ending of The Beyond, the characters of May and her grandmother, like Bob, escape certain death by entering this world. The house in the film's final scene is initially calming. It is dimly lit, the window framed behind the two children, coloured with soft greens and blues, and Mrs. Freudstein is a softly spoken old lady in Victorian-era dress. But the scene soon cuts to a long shot of Mrs. Freudstein walking down the long driveway of the house by the cemetery, holding the hands of the children either side of her. The circular and entrapped nature of this world is emphasized initially by the sounds of the main theme playing, as heard at the start of the film when Bob stares at the picture of the house by the cemetery, and by the pan back to the house that shows a light on inside. That we understand only the children and Mrs. Freudstein to be part of this world means that only they can be inside the house. The long driveway, therefore, leads nowhere, and Bob appears to be trapped within this uncanny place. Emphasizing the circularity and ambiguity of this situation is the quote from author Henry James that appears over this final image. "No one will ever know whether children are monsters or monsters are children." This quote above all reveals Fulci's attitude towards children. That no one will ever know is a strongly ironic statement to conclude the film. Earlier, Bob states that parents never listen, they only do what they want. If his parents had listened to him, they would never have even discovered the house. Perhaps the implication of the Henry James quote is therefore actually parents will never know will never know whether children are monsters or monsters are children because they never listen. It is worth noting that in this last scene, the children do not utter a word, with Bob being figuratively silent in the initial narrative simply due to his mother ignoring his advice. The knowledge he has about the dangers of the world is rendered useless due to his literal silence in the alternate but still adult-controlled world. In the films of Lucio Fulci, children are powerless everywhere and safe nowhere. Indeed, Bob's parents have been removed and he escapes into the world of the picture. Freudstein is not even seen again. It could be argued that his character is a figment of Bob's nightmarish imagination, invented in his own mind as a means of escapism from a life he is not happy in. Let's finish with a few discussions around the Lovecraftian. Cemetery has been linked to both Lovecraft and The Shining. the Stanley Kubrick 1980 classic. As Troy Howarth argues, the New England setting is evocative of Lovecraft's work, as is the sense that something is hiding in the dark. Indeed, Freudstein is hiding in the dark of the basement for nearly the entire film. Howarth feels that the emphasis on a horrific sense of evil and foreboding is Lovecraftian, while the depiction of a child character in touch with the spirit world evokes The Shining. Bob's entire relationship with May throughout the film is representative of both of these factors. The house itself is a personification of evil and foreboding, given it is initially revealed to Bob as a picture before his family moves there and evil begins to happen within it. Additionally, the one only has to consider Danny in The Shining to notice Cemetery's similarities to that film. Within the hotel in The Shining, Danny can interact with the spirit world in the infamous scene in which two twin girls ask Danny to come play with us forever and ever and ever. What Danny sees cuts between the two girls in neat dresses and the gruesome image of their deaths. Much like Bob's experiences with the supernatural world, specifically through the connection with May, his experiences oscillate between the pleasantness of childhood and total horror. Lovecraftian and Gothic mixing. According to Spooner, for Lovecraft, horror writing and fantasy offered an antidote to the modern world. The most cursory of glances at Fulci's Gates of Hell trilogy reveals a strong influence of the early 19th century author H.P. Lovecraft. Fulci's work includes some obvious references to Lovecraft's work, such as a copy of the Book of Eibon, one of the books in Lovecraft's fictional Cthulhu mythos that appears in the Beyond. Fulci's films also include structural and stylistic similarities to Lovecraft's work. As an author who created vivid images of horror as a means of generating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, Lovecraft can be considered a strong influence on Fulci's work beyond some generic odes and references. This is partly because Fulci's Gates of Hell trilogy, starting with City, has a very similar atmosphere to Lovecraft's work. Indeed, the presence of zombie-like creatures in both City and the Beyond emphasizes that these films do not lie completely within the Gothic genre. The character of Freudstein in Cemetery almost literally mixes the two, given his cobweb-infested dwelling in the basement. He terrifies a family, is an extremely Gothic trope, but his literal monstrosity is much more Lovecraftian. He is much more creature than he is human. Callie Hurley discusses the hybridity of Lovecraft's creatures with a reference to Wilbur Whateley in The Dunwich Horror. Whateley, as Hurley summarizes, is the offspring of a human woman and an otherworldly entity. With this understanding and some analysis of City of the Living Dead, one can begin to understand how important the Lovecraft influence is in Fulci's Gothic films. City of the Living Dead can be identified as a supernatural horror film, in which a deliberately underdeveloped plot allows for a number of extremely violent spectacles. After an unidentified priest hangs himself in a cemetery, which is revealed to be in the Lovecraft-inspired town of Dunwich, he opens one of the gates of hell, which sets off a chain reaction that continues throughout the film, in which a series of extremely violent and rather inexplicable things seem to be able to happen at any given moment. Mary, a psychic, and a reporter named Peter attempt to close the gates of hell before All Saints' Day. In his study of Lovecraft's work, Walden argues there is an abandonment of the heroic premise and generic situations, focusing instead on the phenomena that often manifests as abhorrence or monstrosity foregrounded against a vast and detached universe. Quite interestingly, this description of Lovecraft also perfectly summarizes City of the Living Dead. While in a generic sense, Mary and Peter are the heroes of the film, they are revealed to be completely inadequate in their position as heroes. For example, At one stage, Peter encourages Mary to show some urgency in their search for the town of Dunwich, but Mary is hungry. After Peter points out there are only 48 hours left until All Saints' Day begins, Mary simply says, "Oh, please, not now." They casually return to their car and go to get some lunch. While Mary and Peter spend most of the film easing themselves around the countryside, many of the other scenes in the film take place in the isolated world of Dunwich, where there are plenty of moments of abhorrence and monstrosity. For example, in perhaps the film's most memorable spectacle of violence, a young couple are parked in a car in an unspecified part of Dunwich and notice the now zombie priest staring at them from outside the car. He stares directly at the woman until her eyes start to bleed, before, in excruciating detail, she vomits up all of her internal organs, including seemingly endless intestines. Her boyfriend watches in horror before the priest appears at the car window, grabs him by the head, and squeezes it until his brain begins to seep out. As the narrative progresses, those killed by the priest slowly start reappearing in the film as zombies, and many more spectacles of violence ensue. As well as being set in Dunwich, it can be seen from this example that City is a film rife with violent spectacles and many moments of monstrosity, and this is highly reminiscent of Lovecraft. Similarly, the very structure of The Beyond has a sort of escapism in the way it concludes. While the two main protagonists of The Beyond ultimately fail to comprehend the changing of the world they are experiencing, the film builds slowly to a crescendo in which it becomes clear the world as they knew it is over. After facing many hellish situations, Liza and John find themselves impossibly back where the horror started, in the basement of the hotel, and witnessing a real-life version of the painting the warlock Schweik had painted at the start of the film. Realizing there is no safety to be had back where they came from, they enter into the metaphorical photo, and the camera reveals their eyes to have turned into the same blindness of previous characters in the film. When they turn around, it is revealed that the entrance to this place has disappeared, and they are now stuck in this vast and detached universe. However, the creatures that pursued them are nowhere to be seen, and Liza and John are therefore safe, at least in a physical sense. They are shown to disappear into the nothingness of this desolate land before it fades into an image of the painting. That is clearly not what could be considered a happy ending in any sense, and indeed the heroism of these characters has been rather ineffectual, but this is very reminiscent of the Lovecraftian approach of escapist catharsis for the viewer through protagonist death. That is, we are to assume they have died, as the picture is best summed up as a misty desert in which a number of seemingly dead humans lay motionless on the ground. At very least, they have permanently exited the world as we knew it, into some kind of purgatory, or at most, they must have entered hell. This is how Fulci's films ended in this era. There is no catharsis. Things are terrifying, inescapable, and all-encompassing. We end Zombie Flesh Eaters with a sense that hell is about to be unleashed. We end all three films in the Gates of Hell trilogy with a sense that we were always in hell. Whilst the New York Ripper is different stylistically, it is similar philosophically. It takes place back in a gritty real world, and it might be the most hellish Fulci film ever made. But that will be discussed next week. Until which, I am the Italian Horror Guy, and this has been the Italian Horror Guy podcast.